So, with an election round the corner, possibly coming, well, anytime soon, as we've said, the only person who really knows that answer is, of course, Rishi Sunak himself, as far as we know. And that could be a date to be predetermined in the future. A lot of people are still saying May, but as I've said before, you can rule out certainly November and probably October as those dates because we don't want to clash too much with, of course, the US presidential election. And of course, you have to at least give 6 weeks notice for a parliamentary, general election. So we know it's going to be sometime soon. We just don't know when. But for Rishi Sunak to now come out and say, oh, police chiefs, how dare you not use these new rules which we have given you to take care of protesters? Don't you see we are descending into mob rule? Well, I'm sorry, Rishi, but who's in charge of the country right now? Who has a very, very large majority in Parliament? That would be, of course, Rishi Sunak. So the idea that we are descending into mob rule isn't really, well, too far from the truth. The reality is, it is Rishi Sunak himself who is, with his current Conservative Party, has descended into true mob rule. So before we get more into this, please do remember to click on the like and the share button. Of course, down below, there are links to my Patreon page, the one of today's link called Buy Me Coffee, where you can buy me coffee, the YouTube thank you button, the Pony Club as well down below, all that stuff. And like I say, click on the like, click on the share button, all helps the support of the channel. So, what's Rishi Sunak talking about? And I think it's worth talking about this before we make more comparisons to his own hilarious mob rule that he has to, well, face himself. He is talking about some of the stuff and the stories that have come forward of MPs being harassed and their families and at their family home as well. Now, I would say this, that yes, you do have a right to protest, but outside an MP's home, I've always said that to me sort of feels uncomfortable. Like, to me, it would not feel right to protest outside of an MP's house. It just wouldn't feel right. Other people, I'm sure, will feel differently. But to me, it just wouldn't feel right, if I'm honest. Because there's going to be more than that MP that lives there. They could have a family. And I don't think it's right to put them under that, type of pressure, especially when many MPs do keep their family very, very much so out of their political lives. I think you've seen stories on the streets of MPs' families, not even the MP themselves, but MPs' families being harassed by people who are protesting. I again think that's wrong. I think that should be called out. But for Rishi Sunak to come out and say that we have now descended into mob rule, because remember, these police powers, these protesting powers that they had, the police right from the beginning have said, we don't really need these extra powers because we've already got, the powers in place to be able to deal with these types of incidents. And yet, what is happening here? It is Rishi Sunak. It is the hard right. It is his own hard right mob in his own party that are furious that the police are not using these very, very strict protesting laws to try and crack down on these people. Because they feel that if the police were to use these powers, well, then maybe these protests would go away. And we're not just talking about Palestinian protests either. There have been farmer protests recently, more protests about cost of living crisis. There's been even protests technically about Ukraine, which would fall under this definition of quote mob rule by Rishi Sunak. So, which mob is he talking about? Um, but at the end of the day, where is the real mob rule? It's the current Conservative Party. They are so split, as we've talked about, I don't know how many different times. There are, at last count, at least 12 different factions, 12 different, well, let's call them what they are, 12 different gangs of hooligans within the Conservative Party, constantly, constantly bringing up trouble, um, threatening rebellion after rebellion, rebelling about rebellions in some cases, being very upset that they suddenly don't get their way when the law is very clear, when it's, if you break the law, it goes to the judges get the final word on the say of the legislation that the parliament has then passed. And we even saw that recently with Liz Truss talking about, the Office of Budget Responsibility did her in. The Office of Budget Responsibility did its job. It is its job to produce an independent report on what the fiscal implications of what a government might be implementing. That's its job. If you don't like it, that's it just doing its job. And yet, this is what we are now seeing that they are trying to implement. This very, very vicious attitude directed towards the civil servants that, it's the civil servants that aren't doing as we pleased. That's why everything is going wrong. It's the civil servants. And yet, going back to the issue of mob rule, all these factions agitating against each other has made Rishi Sunak himself completely unable to govern. And if you are going into a general election, which Rishi Sunak probably is, the last thing you want on your election literature when you have been the prime minister, when Britain slipping into mob rule has been on your watch. Also, bear in mind, going into recession, you'll notice there hasn't been a lot of talk from the Conservatives about, Britain sliding into recession during that time. Rishi going into the next general election doesn't look good to say that, oh my word, everywhere is mob rule now. What are we going to do? And yet, if Rishi Sunak wants to look at the mob, at the mob that he's trying to sort of rule, he need to only look back during PMQs to look back at his own party. Because there has been no more clear example of mob rule and gang warfare than the Conservative Party for the past, well, at least since 2016. Because that is how they have acted. They have acted like the most unruliest of mobs, declaring that if they don't get their way, they are going to force issues, rules, laws for what would essentially be a very small minority. And it has been the extremists on the right who have gotten their way time after time after time again. And this has pushed the Conservative Party more and more to the right wing. And yet, when they don't get their way, they cry, they victim blame. So the reality is, Rishi Sunak can talk all he wants about Britain sliding into mob rule because, quite frankly, it simply hasn't happened. The real mob rule and the real mob is his own Conservative Party. So, as always, thank you very much for joining us. And of course, as always, we'll see you all next time.